Hi everyone, thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson, I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and tonight I am very glad, after many moons, we are finally able to welcome Muriel Leung as we celebrate her novel, How to Fall in Love in a Time of Unnameable Disaster. Let's give Muriel a hand. Joining us here. We are happy to have you. Muriel is joined tonight by K-Ming Chang. Let's give a hand for K-Ming as well. A very dynamic pair that was quite aptly halted from weather last time, considering like the book. I think it's like deeply ironic. But exactly. Unnameable Disaster. But guess what? Cannot be stopped. Unstoppable. Queer delight. We love it. So happy you are here. I have a little bit of business before I let these two take over. Hello, hi. Thank you for joining us in person. Thank you also for joining us online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving to a camera if you cannot see. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We open each of our events with a land acknowledgement, and so I would like to let you know that we are operating on unceded Ramaytush land. As such, we think that land acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. If you are interested in how to participate in this project of rematriation, we usually direct people to the back desk where we have information about the Ramaytush Land Trust and how you can participate there. Very brief business before I let these two take over. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. I didn't ask earlier, how do we feel about picture taking? Fine? Okay, great. Picture taking is fine, but no bad pictures. That is only good pictures. Do not tag our authors in bad pictures. That's the one rule. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event you are currently attending. Please do, if you are able, buy books from us as an independent bookstore. We have books by both of our authors at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an indie bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. And I think they would gladly sign them at the end of the evening, and you can have it personalized, which is a very cool opportunity. Take advantage of it. I encourage you to take advantage of it. And if you already have a copy of these books, buy one for a friend. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors who are joining us tonight. First, K-Ming Chang is the author of the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice novel Bestiary, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize and the Otherwise Award. Her story collection, Gods of Want, won a Lambda Literary Award. And her latest books are Organ Meats and a novella titled Cecilia, which happens to be a Green Apple favorite. All of them are, but Cecilia especially. Her next two books, a novel and a short story collection, are forthcoming from Simon & Schuster. Let's give one more hand for K-Ming Chang. And last but most certainly not least, from Queens, New York, Muriel Leung is the author of the poetry collections Imagine Us, The Swarm, Bone Confetti, and Images Seen to Images Felt in collaboration with artist Christine Thompson. She serves on the board of directors for Apogee Journal. She received her PhD in creative writing and literature from the University of Southern California. I didn't realize I should be calling you Dr. Leung. I apologize.
My mom loves me so much.
She is a permanent faculty at the California Institute of the Arts, and her novel, How to Fall in Love in a Time of Unnameable Disaster, is the reason we are here tonight. Please give one more hand for Dr. Muriel Leung.
Thank you so much, Car, for that. And I can speak for you as well too. Like, there's so much love for Green Apple Books and small bookstores who are doing such great work in a time of deep technocratic violence. So fuck Amazon, love Green Apple Books. And thank you for rescheduling. The last time, Cara was referring to the last time we had this event scheduled, and then there was, weather that got in the way. But aptly so, because this is a book that's so much about weather in one's hearts, metaphorically, and also literally in the world. So I thought I would start by reading from an excerpt from this book, which takes place in New York City, which is where I'm from. And at the center of this story is Vera and Mal, who are two women who, break up at the start of these storms that happen. And these are acid rainstorms that happen every Tuesday. And so they had to make some decisions and split. And throughout this novel, there's also a lot of characters that come into play too. There's a cockroach with an existential crisis. There's a headless man, who Mira also has a brief dalliance with, and then other ghosts and other characters in it. And so I thought I would read from the titular chapter, How to Fall in Love in a Time of Unnameable Disaster. Leaving was gradual until it was not. The day that I left, the crack in the ceiling of our studio apartment had widened and the acid rain leaked through. We had cleared out several rubber buckets by then, but it seemed futile after a certain point, so we let it spill over, the liquid then seeping into the plastic covering of the floor tiles, causing a trail to bubble over. As the trail expanded, boxes were shoved out of the way, sometimes tilting awkwardly in the middle of the too small room. Mal and I talked to each other across the apartment through these pillars of forgotten objects, some older than Mal and me combined, in which I was forbidden from opening. Instead, I left post-it notes on these boxes that read, I love you, Mal, and maybe today will be better, and we're going to be okay. I thought it all true for a while until my hope gave out. Then I left another note instead. We have to talk. From behind one of the pillars of boxes, Mal emerged. She shook her head. Whatever you're going to say, I already know. Her words echoed between the boxes. I reached for her behind one of the stacks, only to hear her voice move farther away. I called out to her, What do you know? You're leaving me. I laid my hand on the side of one of the boxes, hoping she would place her hand there. She didn't. That's not it, I began, but the knot in my throat widened. I want you to come too. I must have sounded convincing because Mal finally came out from behind one of the columns to look directly at me. I rushed my plea. We can pack some of these things in boxes, like this one. I pointed to one of the boxes at the very top, spilling over with aged documents. This one has your parents' immigration papers and photos. We can put these in filing cabinet. Get one of those push carts to roll it all the way down to Manhattan. You remember that time we walked all the way across the bridge to the city? It was only a couple hours and it was doable. We can go to the corner store, pick up some rain gear, be extra careful, and I stopped to study Mel's face, which had gone blank while I was sputtering, no telling if she was angry or sad or both. I begged, Mel, please, I don't know if I can come back for you. She said nothing at first and stared out the window boarded up with X's. You could make out slithers of sky through it all, looming and gray and heavy with impending rain. She told me once that at night, when she could not sleep, she would watch the roaches climbing up the window. Her grandmother would spoon her gently, and together they would count the bugs as they came and went, unsure if a roach was counted once, twice, 3 times. Sometimes at night I would feel Mal awake beside me, whispering the count out loud, 1, 2, 3. Mal looked at me in silence for a long while before finally turning away. Please, just go. I searched her face for more. To leave meant this was over, the two of us, Mal and Mira, Mira and Mal. We had been inseparable and had said on more than one occasion that being apart would be like severing a piece of our own body. In the space between us then, I felt myself saying goodbye to my own left side of my own sack of flesh. I looked at Mal as she slowly backed away. Mal, I don't want to die. The words came out in sobs. I waited for Mal to say something, anything. She didn't. My knees hit the floor before I could catch myself, and on all fours I crawled to her, placed her face against my thigh. Please, Mal, we can't keep living here like this. I don't want you to die either. When I looked up, Mal was shaking her head, and I could see that she was crying too. Through her tears, she cried out, "You said you weren't afraid. You said it. I believed you." Her palm covered my eyes as if she did not want me to see. I held her by the wrist for as long as she would let me, and together we heaved and wept in unison until the first rumble in the sky jolted us back to where we stood. It was time to go. The rain was coming soon. If I stayed, I knew I would never leave. You're right, I said it all wrong. This is a new brave thing. Come with me, Mal, I begged again. Even with her palm still resting across my eyes, I could feel her considering it. Mal lifted her palm. Above me, her face was wet with tears. She placed her hand against my cheek and said at last, "I love you so much, Muriel." I reached for her. "I love you so much, Mal." "I'm so sorry." "I'm sorry too." Wordlessly, I stood up and gathered my things in trash bags. It all seemed a blur those next moments. Before I left the apartment, I took one final look back at Mel, who was resting on one of the stacks. Her shoulders were hunched over, and though I could not see her face, I knew she was quietly folding into herself. She was already too far away, and I knew she was on her way to becoming a ghost.
Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. It was so moving. And we will talk about cockroaches later. So that will be important. I was like, I'm so excited. So I wanted to start. I'm personally a huge fan of the apocalypse because the end of the world usually means the beginning of a new one. But what I love is the nuanced way you've approached the apocalypse, the horrors of it, but also the ways in which we can fail each other, love each other in the wake of it. How apocalypses are always happening and have already happened. So I wondered for you as a writer, what drew you to the idea of unnameable disaster, and what is your relationship to the apocalypse?
Oh, that's a big question. I think the apocalypse, I think for a lot of us now means something so different.
Yeah.
And I talk a lot about how apocalypse doesn't feel like a metaphor anymore, and maybe for writers of science fiction fantasy that's never really been so much the case. I think for like writers like Octavia Butler, I think it's always been something that felt prescient. And so maybe it was never metaphorical, but I think that more so now than ever, I feel like it's so present and also imminent at the same time, the sort of rolling apocalypse that is happening. But I think also, I think what I hope this novel can do is kind of put this like deep focus into a particular kind of disaster, which is this one that's happening in a place that I call home in New York City, and feels like, representative of a time in which several decades ago, maybe 1 decade ago, there was and some change. There was Hurricane Sandy, which did lead to loss of power and water for a lot of residents in New York City, particularly for those living in the housing projects in the lower Manhattan, in which my family lived. And so we saw this kind of like disaster happening, and it was very closely after Katrina too. So I think the memories of that were pretty fresh in sort of like national memory. And also because I think New York City and the way that which it's governed has this kind of sense of impenetrability. And I think to your point too, apocalypse reminds us that we are so very mortal and vulnerable, which are what queer, disabled people feel all the time too. And I think have always built systems outside of the governing infrastructure to survive. And so it's really just a reminder of that, apocalypse as a way of showcasing the survival method that's always been in play. And it's like highly activated during a time of increased need. And I find that right now we're challenging ourselves to think about new ways of sharing space and time with each other that I think is really can be very generative, but it also means coming across new challenges of like other forms of like urgency and demands of like our time, our body, and our energy. And what do we need to do, I guess, to respond to that, like this new form of apocalypse that's happening, and then tomorrow's a new one, and so on and so forth. And so I think, this novel is a way of answering a particular question of this unnameable disaster that's really about not just the literal rain that's happening, but also the kind of destruction that's happening on their most intimate relationships.
Yeah, that's so resonant. I love what you said about like queerness, about building something outside of that, like governance or like a new kind of infrastructure. I think that's so beautiful. And this segues perfectly also, and you mentioned New York City. Something that I love so much about this book is how rooted it is in a deep sense of the communal. So you mentioned the housing projects, and also about like personal losses being really tied to systemic forces as well. And even when we have a first person narrator, there's this constant sense of the collective in literal ways like communal living, but also with the proximity between the living and the dead. And there's this kind of running thread of collective care, neighbors taking care of one another, ghosts in the living taking care of one another. But there's also the kind of like systemic failure of collective cares, or the ways that we have failed to do it in a certain way too. I'm particularly haunted by the story of a girl who was killed and the line, "In a city full of people and no one could recognize a face full of terror." That was something that really stuck with me as I was reading. So this is a bit of a two-part question. One is, what interests you about writing about communities in particular, and this being such a place-based, like rooted work? And then also, do you approach writing as like a communal or solitary activity? Because we often talk about like, oh, writing is so solitary, and this book is so like its web of relationships are so important.
Yeah. I think it's sort of straddling that line between like not wanting to romanticize collective care, because that's also places in which harms can happen too. So I think it's accurate to represent the ways, and even in our best efforts, like we still hurt each other, and even then we like overlook, we overlook the things that are happening. But in the context, I think in which you're mentioning too, I love the story in which then Mira's mom, the character of Mira's mom, I think like then becomes very attached to, is based on like a real life story of a young girl in my school. I went to school in Chinatown, New York, where it was like predominantly Chinese American kids, and then there was a girl who went missing who didn't speak much English, and I think the repeated sort of messaging in the news kind of elided the fact that there is this kind of outside violence that had happened, and that this community was like our community was like deeply upset by it. And then years later, I remember looking at these really upsetting like news comments to the newspaper, and then someone had written something of like, well, there's like a lot of foul play here. We think it's the parents, because like in the mother's rendition of the story, the mother had said something like, she had kissed her child goodbye in the morning, and then they're like, well, we know for a fact Chinese people don't do that. And so I remember like being so struck by it, and I was just like, and thinking about like how like from the outside, if you're not Chinese, like how it's viewed as like they don't like the forms of different kinds of intimacy is not visible. And I think when you grow up in Chinatown and you don't ever have to address like whiteness, like like that publicly, especially when you're younger, you don't think about like the other forms of intimacy and what it can look like that may not represent perhaps like non-Chinese like views. And so I think it really struck me in terms of thinking like, what then is like, what is the care and love that I see in my communities? And it's a very deeply flawed form of care, in which then like sometimes like these very communities overlook the domestic violence that's happening. But I think there's also simultaneously a making space of people to make their own choices in the environments in which they're stuck, and they're already vulnerable, like not trying to assert a certain value system about like what does it mean to leave or to be able to stay. And I think that in this environment in which like they're all quarantined because of the storm, like everyone has to stay. So if you have to stay, what kind of choices do you have to make in that space? And to give people like some credit about like the ways in which they have to navigate the difficulties of that space. And those choices may not be the ones that we approve of individually, but they are still choices that we need to honor in some ways because these are vulnerable communities that are struggling. And I'm wondering too, like what kind of compassion we can access for those folks.
Yeah, I love that idea of what you were saying about like not romanticizing that collective care and how we have this ideal of it, but like you said, there's also that capacity to do harm. I think that's such a really nuanced and like evocative way to kind of approach that, writing it. And I also love this question of like love and care and what that can look like. And like you said, how it can be really deeply flawed or have so many different facets to it. And what I love so much about this book, and also what feels really clear to me as well, is that I'm like, oh wow, every story in this book is a love story. And there's so many forms of love, and it feels like one form of love isn't necessarily prioritized or seen as more important as another. It feels kind of like this ecosystem of love. And all these forms of love at their core seem to share the same source or the same need, whether it's romantic relationships or familial relationships or chosen family. So did you approach writing this book knowing what this web of relationships would be, and knowing, which love stories would be at the heart of it, or was it something you uncovered as you were writing?
Yeah, I think center to this story, I think, is Muriel and Mel's relationship. But I think how special it is to focus on two people who are so young in their early 20s, as I once was, and believe that this was like the end, this was like it, And I think to be in that place and to honor that, like, however flawed this relationship is, like, they are each other's like end games to some extent until the weather came and then that was challenged, right? But it was seen as more of a product of external circumstances than anything that's like deeply rooted in their dynamic. And then I think the things that then continue to challenge them in that kind of like afterlife of their relationship are these characters who have different perspectives of love that are sometimes selfish, self-driven, or come from a different sort of value system than their own. And I like the idea then, in order for two people to have any kind of shift, even in the aftermath of their relationship, requires other people to provide that kind of shift. So I enjoyed writing characters like Mira's mom and this character Lucinda, who's a neighbor who also lost her son in fire, who's queer. And Lucinda and the mom like strike up this like friendship, and it feels like a very queer friendship in many ways, right? But I think they, unbeknownst to them, in that they have these queer children, and they are all grappling with this idea of like, what does it mean to have queer children, and to find a way to come into acceptance of their respective children in this aftermath that comes at the end of like, someone's passed and then someone's grieving someone, and what does it mean for them? How does that shift their relationship as two women who, are basically single moms in many ways. And I like that idea of their exploring their queerness, even if it's not romantically so, and that permits them to also have some more expansive ideas of how to approach their queer children, which I feel it feels utopic for me.
No, I love this like multi-directional, intergenerational, multi-level queerness that's happening. I'm like, it's like the apartment building, but it's like every level is gay. And it's like feeding into my working lifelong theory that like all women's friendships are queer in some way. So I love that so much. I also love that you're describing them as like each other's end games, and even though they're very young, and now I'm like, oh my god, is every relationship an endgame relationship? Because we all live many lives and we all have many selves, and we're like shedding. Anyway, so I was like, wow, this is so incredible. But speaking of endgame and kind of like living past your end in a way, because I feel like this book is about people kind of surviving their ends and surviving the end as well. I wanted to talk a bit about ghosts, because I feel like ghosts in literature, they're often like a reflection of human anxiety or fear. or they're like a device that we use to reflect the living. And we really get to inhabit the ghosts in this book, and they respond to the desires of the living, but they also have their own desires, their own selves, their own need for justice, in a way that I found really moving, and that gives a certain kind of agency to the ghostly. There's also the phrase, the dead are not really the dead. So I guess what draws you to ghosts in particular, and do you have any, I don't know, like ghost stories, ghost media that you were drawing from, or like a ghostly tradition that interested you in particular? But yeah, just in general, ghosts.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many different iterations of ghost stories among like Asian cinema too. So I think that a lot of it is also adapted from this sort of like tradition of, I think, addressing ancestors, or the ways in which like the realm of the living and the dead are somewhat shared in some ways, and the ways in which you connect is like through practices like burning paper money, effigies that are representative, like paper forms of objects in which you would want the dead to have. And in a way, I think it's a closer kind of like conduit like relationship than I think maybe more Western ideas of death, in which it's like ghosts are inherently scary, you don't want anything to deal with them, objects are haunted, and you don't want anything to do with anything that's like considered like dead objects. And I think it's interesting to think about a world in which the dead are like your family members in your own home, but maybe they're just not corporeal, but they still stir up shit and they still talk shit and they're still annoying, and also, like they have eternity that they're grappling with, or this sort of like a sense of like unendingness, like they don't know their conditions. And so in a way, like if you are grappling with eternity and that is your new sort of afterlife mission, I do think your objectives are going to be very different. Like how would you live your afterlife if you knew you don't know what's going to happen next, like you don't know when you're going to pass over, so you might as well just revel and just have some fun, which I think is why one of the characters, Grandpa Y, who's Mira's grandfather, I think decides to do so after a life of working very hard the factory.
Yeah, I love Grandpa Y, and you're so right. I'm like, oh yeah, you would. Shit talking ghosts, like you would. That's what you would want to be in a way. It's like, what would you do if you're a ghost gossip? Yeah, and I love what you were saying about this kind of unendingness, like this perpetuity. Because the chronology of the book is really interesting, and we begin with the end in a way and snake our way to various beginnings. And in the first story, we end with the image of the bathtub as a kind of womb, which I love. So it's like death to birth to death. And the book also describes trauma as this cyclical process. So I was wondering, how did you find the structure for this book? And did anything surprise you as you were writing?
Yeah, I think one method that I think has really helped is really just to let the characters drive the stories too. And I think it's gone through so many revisions, because I think in earlier ones, the characters felt like caricatures of themselves, and I didn't want that. But it's also because their stories were originally, this was pitched as a linked collection, and so the stories had their own individual narratives. They didn't really like connect so much like intentionally. But then when I started to think about like if you were to really have these characters in a place and same space, and they had a shared narrative, like what would be the common thing? And it is really about Mira and Mal at the end of the day, like the power of Mira's grief, Mal's Mal's gone elsewhere, but I think their presence still haunts the pages. And what is it like to be living with someone like Mira, whose grief is so palpable, and whose want and desire for someone who they cannot have is like completely messing with everyone's sense of like normalcy. And so it forces like another character to have to grapple with their ex. It forces Mira's mom to then have to like want her to have like a hetero relationship so badly so she can just like move on and just like have someone who can give her like this so-called happy life. It forces like Lucinda to also like grapple with her own grief about her son and also her loneliness. And so I think there is something really powerful about how someone else's grief can also like be an activating force for all of you, and then vice versa, right? The things they do then come back to affect Mira. And I think that's what happens when you have characters in a confined space. Like a lot of things happen inevitably, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of letting the characters lead you and kind of, like you said, like an activating force or like almost like a chemical reaction of placing these characters in this world and letting them, I don't know, throw sparks in a way. I think that's so beautiful. And I think that, I don't know, there's like a kind of leaping into the void, maybe a bit of that too, of not having it like mapped out in a way that I find really interesting and beautiful. And speaking of Mira, there's a line where Mira says, "When I say faith, I mean the assurance of something beyond description," which is another line that I love so much. And I feel like writing is also a great act of faith in many ways. And like you were describing, like letting the characters lead you, guide you, that in itself is a leap of faith as well. So I wanted to ask, maybe this is like kind of a big question, but I'll ask you, like, what do you believe in when you write? And what are the things that continue to build or hold your faith?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, the other day I was, I keep getting the definition of this word wrong, which is deja vu. And so it happened like multiple times actually recently where I was like saying it, someone has said it, and then I was like, well, that's not, and they're using it correctly, but then for me, I'm just like, it doesn't register. Like, I'm just like, what do you mean there's an incorrect perception that something has like happened before? Of course it's possible that could happen before, and perhaps like it could have happened now, it could also have happened in a different timeline. And in my mind I was like, oh my god, I realized that in my actual belief system there is multiple timelines happening at once. So there is an alternative timeline in which I'm like still connected to all my exes, which is like a horrifying reality that I live with every day. And I realize it's like not a crisis that other people have. And then I'm just like, and so I think in unpacking my then miscomprehension of deja vu, it is like, yes, I think my belief is that there's alternate realities that are coexisting right now, and which may be beyond comprehension. And so this book could also possibly be representative of one. Too, in which case then there is a kind of faith, even if I'm not aware of it consciously, but I think it was like I kept getting stuck on this idea of like, what do you mean there's not, like, of course there's another reality happening simultaneously, which is also the truth. So in what sense nothing is false. And I think it's really frustrating. I think for my partner is a really realist, pragmatic person. And so so I think that kind of faith does, I think, lend itself to more speculative writing, which I'm sure also for you too, right?
No, I love that. I completely agree. I feel like now I've just realized I've always misunderstood the idea of deja vu. I'm right there with you. No. Exactly. Like infinite endgames.
Exactly.
Also horrified by that idea. You're talking like the X's, the proliferation of different lives. Anyway, but I guess also what I was thinking as you were speaking is I was like, oh, that's also very, I feel like a multi-genre way to look at life as well. Because now I'm like, oh, maybe this particular book, there's like a poetry collection version of it. There's like a memoir version of it. There are all these different versions of it, and I feel like it's interesting. Maybe it's not interesting, but I'm really interested in how, I don't know, the form of the book is so varying. We have like radio broadcasts and transmissions and interludes, and then also parts of the book that feel more essayistic. And yeah, I guess as someone who writes across many forms in many genres, I'm like, oh, you are living like parallel lives even within this one book. Like there are so many different parts, like so many different versions of your own writing self or like your own writing voice that get to live in this book, which makes it feel so kaleidoscopic. But I guess maybe now this is kind of like reducing the question a bit, but like what does fiction allow you, I guess speculative fiction, allow you to do that feels, very particular to this book, and like what itch does it scratch for you?
Yeah, I guess maybe behind that question is also like, what does poetry do for you? Because you also came from that background too, and I find that when I read your work, I see the poet influence, and I find that there's a lot of poets I know who I think are branching out into other genres, like essay collections, memoir, fiction, especially speculative fiction, where it feels like there feels like a sort of like natural sort of move into these other genres, and I think that there must be something about the understanding around poetry as form and also its like possibilities, and so also like understanding of sort of lyricism of the language and letting the language carry it itself more so than thinking about sort of more traditional constraints like plot, right? Like it's not like this has to happen. I think there's something about like letting sort of a music or sensory like feel like moment of something carry itself all the way through, and then I think it sends you into a portal of something new, which I think is something that does happen a lot in speculative fiction, where there is like a lot of world building in which, especially in this novel, in which many things are going on, and I think it is in my intention for it to be so excessive in many ways, since in a sensorial like way, but I think that in that way that is also the poetry part too, which is also very, like, which I think is also like a sort of world building, and so in that sense I think the themes of this work are like also emblematic of themes that are also in the poetry and essays that I write, but I think the ways in which I get to explore the interior lives of the characters is something I don't get to do as much in other genres, and perhaps that's the only distinction really. But I think acid rainstorms can exist in poetry and also in essay forms as well too, and I think but I think the insight into the ways in which different characters lives get to influence each other, that's something that I think is really unique to fiction, and which I'm grateful for.
Yeah, I love the way you describe fiction as being this place of like interiority, because I feel like you're right. Usually when we talk about fiction, we talk so much about like external, what is the scene, what is the dialogue, what is the plot. So I love that. And I also love what you said earlier. I feel like it connects with the idea of activation, what you were talking about, the characters activating it, and now I'm thinking like, less about plot and more about activation. And I don't know, it makes me think of like your fiction as like a Frankenstein like creature that you're just like electricity, like strike of lightning and activates it, which I feel like is a much more exciting way of thinking about a work of fiction necessarily than like what you were saying about, having to have a linear plot or having to have a certain kind of engine or a certain kind of logic.
Right.
It's just like, let the Frankenstein creature lead you, lead you down the path. I love that. And I also love what you were saying about myth making and world building, and poetry also being a space of world building too, though we don't usually talk about it in that way. And also Grandpa Y is like such a myth maker and world builder in the book as well. And there's the Ursula K. Le Guin quote about science fiction being the mythology of the modern world, and I feel like this book is very much the mythology of our modern world. What about, I just was interested in like speculative fiction in particular, and its possibilities and how you approach something like world building.
Yeah, I think like, for me, like, and I, because I'm teaching also a fiction class right now for undergraduate students who are writing speculative fiction, and they have this sense of like what they want to write about. They're just like, all right, they're in an underground bunker, and this girl, she's part of a gang, and she's like, she's gonna go to school, but then also she has to fight these other gangs, and then she meets her long lost sister, and then they go on a road trip, and then then they murder this other gang, and then I'm just like, okay, let's go back to the bunker. Like, tell me more about the bunker. And I think that's it. It's just like I think maybe because like when we think about story, we're usually thinking about like what happens. And maybe for me, the world building, it's like what's here, and I think letting the sort of circumstances dictate what's here, and I think the particularities of it, even down to the fact that like, New York City has bodegas, and we like, and there's like straws like that we have. I mean, just like that detail, I feel like if you just like even focus on that detail, like the day that like the straws go away, it's like a big one in New York City, and I think if you focus on that detail, actually there is a whole story behind it. So I think it's actually having faith in the fact that like the world in which we live in now is already populated with so much happening, so we don't actually need to create anything sensationalized, like to produce interest. I think the interest starts from what's already here, and I think rendering it in such a way so that people can also see it. And I think the asset brainstorm is there, and it's described, but it's really not the main thing. It's the reason why people are inside. But I think the true actual world building is the people who populate these pages. And so, you can write about how this rain looks like, you can write about what it does to the outside world, but I think it's more fascinating actually to look at what keeps people inside,
Yeah, I love that question, what's here? Like there's already, so the world already blooms from that question of what's here. Yeah. I love that. Okay, we will now transition to the Q&A portion, but really quickly before that, this will only take 30 seconds. I like to do a rapid fire round. I pre-warned Muriel about this. So it'll be just a few this or that questions, and then we'll open it up to our beautiful world here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so nervous.
Okay, no. It's quick. It'll just be automatic. It'll be great. Okay. New York City cockroach or New York City subway rat?
Oh my gosh, cockroach.
Oh. Short story collection or essay collection?
Short story collection.
With a whimper or with a bang?
With a quiver.
Oh. I love that. Such a poet's answer. Mythology or memory?
Like a fragment. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Radio or television?
Television.
Beginnings or endings?
Middle.
Oh my god, I love it. We're getting so many invented options here. Okay. Platonic or romantic?
Oh, romantic.
Oh. Conjuring or exorcism?
Conjuring.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, now we will open up to questions.
Before we do, Norrin has so beautifully come up with these coasters. These are limited edition coasters, which features one of our characters in the book, Shin the cockroach. So we were thinking that if you wanted to ask a question, you also get, I will throw you one of these coasters to the best of my projectile ability. So if you were feeling shy, let this be incentivizing.
Oh, it is the cockroach. I love your loyalty to the cockroaches.
I know,
it's so beautiful.
I have to. Even though they terrify me so much still. Yes. Questions for coasters.
Okay. We haven't talked about sad yet.
Sorry. This is hard. Is that hard?
I was worried about the throwing.
Sorry. I'll walk it over.
The aim was true.
We haven't talked about sad yet, and just how this headless character who's being haunted by his previous love, and we get to see flashbacks of a life he lived in the before times. How did this headless character who finds himself in love again come to you like this? How did that character come to be?
Well, so Sad is a character introduced in the very first story, and when I first had this story workshopped, it was for me it's a very queer story, Mira and Mel, and it's still a queer story. It's really Mira is bisexual, but I think in the end, she gets with Sad, but that's not the end, right? But I think there were just too many people who were so excited. And I was just literally, this guy has done nothing. He literally just showed up. That's all he did. Sam just showed up, and then you're like, and everyone was just like head over heels. They were just like, he's perfect. And I was like, wow, what does it say about the low bar? That
He has no head.
Yeah, he literally has no head. He's not, he's nice, but that's really it. And I think I just got so frustrated, and also realistically too, it's like he either must come with like his own baggage, right, and his grappling with it, and it's like just because he's nice that's not enough to write a character. And so for him, grappling with his ex and his also persistence in his relationship with Mira, who he didn't really know other than from a distance, and he as a romantic himself had certain kind of aspirations for that relationship with Mira too, as we all do, right? We get into relationships for all sorts of reasons, and it doesn't negate the sincerity of the love. But I think if you're not willing to grapple with literally the ghosts of your exes, then I think that you inevitably bring that into the relationship. And so for Sad, I wanted to see him, I think, grapple with that a little bit, and then to also see that the ways in which someone can in their own mind believe that they are doing something wholly good and try to convince themselves that it's not self-driven, but ultimately it is. And I think that is what leads to the events that ensues, and I think also a world of hurt. But this is all to say that Mira too, I think in some ways could also be seen as selfish for pursuing something while also still clinging to her ex as well. So I think they're both culpable in that way. But I think that that's also just real. And I think also too, even despite all of that, he does do something at some point, and then I think that's still people still, I guess in some readerships, I think it's still seen as he's great, he's so great, why can't they just be together? And I'm like, maybe I did something wrong.
It's not you, because I was about to mention there was this viral meme of a headless mannequin that everyone was like, wow, he's so attractive. So there's something going on with headless men and people who need help, in my opinion. So it's not you, it's the world.
I don't like this moment in their time.
Yeah, I don't like it either. I don't like it either.
Well, thanks for that. Maybe I can just bring. Yeah, it's safer this way. Yeah, and back and then over to the side.
For speaking, I was curious to hear more about what your process was like going from what you said about the characters feeling like caricatures to becoming real. I was curious what you saw in your head, and if you see all the characters in the same space, and their sort of interactions is creating that sense of reality, or there's something like that.
Yeah, I think originally that kind of flattening did happen with Grandpa Y, who is Mira's grandfather, who I think shows up in this current reality with sort of a lot of poltergeisty kind of attributes. And so he's joking about farting a lot, and he's zipping around the room, and he's totally non-serious and kind of talks in riddles. But then every once in a while there's something lucid in what he's saying. But before I got to that point, I think he was mostly just kind of this cartoonish character who I think I wanted to show as just this is the kind of extreme that can happen, right? And then sort of tensions of, Mira doesn't remember, her grandpa so much because he passed very early on, but Mira's mom is, I think, having this moment of not recognizing her dad. And then I realized that needed to be deeper than that. You can't just be a cartoon. And I think what about this idea of someone who's just the unexpected hero in some way, who is, I think, who has certain secrets or knowledge that is just like many elders in their community don't get listened to. But if you did listen to him, and you pay attention, he is giving clues about what this kind of afterlife could be and look like. And I think if we did listen to like our elders and had more patience around that, like I think that we could actually see more. And so we get into this chapter with his story. We see a little bit about his own narrative, his struggles, his movement through love. And I think that getting an opportunity to do that has been like really, like it felt really great to be able to spend time in the character, and then to like show that even though he's flawed in his own ways too, like I think his acceptance of Mira, it comes from a different kind of place, right? And I think it's not something that's expected. But I think he has a certain perception in this kind of afterlife of survival that I think like once I started writing him, I realized, and I think about ways in which our characters can surprise you, and also the ways in which they come to conclusions about their values, what they believe in, also come forward from like the difficulty of their experiences. And in the end, like when push comes to shove, like what do you believe in the most? And it's like, your family, the people you love, right? However you choose to define family. And so I felt like glad that I was able to take Grandpa Y on this journey and to give him that life that he didn't get to have in his like living life. And I think that feels the most honest, right, to an experience of writing any character or anyone we know in this like current reality. It's just like their depth, their complications, their contradictions even, and the ways in which they do come to surprise us in the end. And I think every character we write should surprise us in some ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. I think you had a question?
I have a question.
Oh yeah.
I already got the
You already got one? Thank goodness, because I'm not really confident in my ability to grow. Yeah.
I really liked what you were saying way earlier about your thoughts on the apocalypse and how that's a present sort of more of a reality for a lot of groups of people. And I started this question in my head as sort of like a silly question, like what's your apocalypse prep? But then I was like, what is your apocalypse prep like? Because when I think about like building community and like all sorts of like these mutual aid stuff that's going on, but I don't know. Do you have anything to say about your apocalypse prep?
So when my partner and I first met, I think one of our first conversations was about how prepped we were for the apocalypse. And so one of their lines was like, I have a machete, And I was like, ooh. Like not the serial killer kind, I hope. And so it was, but I think we were talking about like what's in our go bag. And then like I like the idea of like, like because we lived in California for a long time, and so the disaster there are like, as you all know, like wildfires and like needing the things that would like go along with it, like mask, water, like lights for when powers go out, and of that sort. And I think like that, is sort of more on the material end of things. And then I think I don't know, I always think about like, I always joke that maybe mostly I have only soft skills to contribute and like one version of the more extreme apocalypse. But then I also feel that like, but I think also like, when I think about, the things that are happening now when it comes to like protests, like mutual aid efforts, like I think it's also just like the things we can contribute within our means is also a really appropriate and necessary response. So whether it is resharing information, disseminating information, correcting inaccuracies like across the messaging and media, providing like teach-ins, like other knowledge, which I do in like my capacity as a professor. And also like having conversations that like maybe like think more broadly, like for me about like the world we kind of live in. So because I teach in an art school, I think I ask a lot of questions about art, and what's and its purpose. And my argument now is always like art is should inherently be useless, so that you can give it the value that means it has is useless in the capitalist sense. And I think in that to find power in it. And I think that perhaps is one tool that I find to be very vital in this particular moment, and then to use that to be the vehicle for any kind of political activation, we can have. And so I think that plus my partner's machete and the various flashlights and like double D batteries that we have, like I think all together perhaps create our go back.
Solid.
I love that. Useless art machete.
Exactly. Yeah, and then one more.
Our last question.
Here, I will safely.
I'm curious, like in more of a detailed sense about your writing process, like if there was like a catalyst moment where you were like, okay, this is my idea and this is the book that I'm writing, and if not, like how your ideas progressed and like what your process was to develop on it, and yeah, like was it kind of something that came all at once, or were you like working on it very intentionally over a period of time, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, it started with the titular story, right? Which originally was supposed to just be a short story for a fiction class I took in my MFA. And I didn't know this kind of story I was going to write. I honestly, because I was a poetry student, I really thought that it was going to come out like some kind of like hybrid, like elliptical, like turn the page like this way and then like turn it into a map kind of experimental exercise. And it came out like a very like plot driven story, and which was very surprising. But then I think the elements that stayed true was like the voice behind it still felt somehow like close to poetry voice. But it also introduced all these characters in it too that I think in the initial response to the work, people were like, it feels like each of these characters would have their own stories. And when I started to think about that, I realized that it's true. And then I started playing with the idea of like, what would it look like if each of these characters had their own stories, which is how I think I started to write into them. And at first they kind of were like separate stories, and that happened to inhabit the same world. But then I think that it brought me continuously back to Mira and Mal, whose love feels at the center of all this. And then I saw a sort of central, narrative kind of like connect for me. But I think it took many revisions of the novel to like understand like who needed to be there and who deserved to have their own story, and also what are the ramifications of the things that they do within their story that then affects the lives of Mira and Mal. And I think I was also doing this. It took a long time. It took 10 years to write because I was also doing it when I was supposed to be writing my dissertation, because it was more fun than writing my dissertation. And then eventually I had to write my dissertation. And then so that took some years off at that time. And then finally, I think like during the height of the pandemic, I got to work with a mentor of mine, Amy Bender at USC, who was so kind to basically print out my stories, leave comments, and then just mail it back to me. And so we just had this like relationship where we would just, send like my stories back and forth via like snail mail, and it just felt like it was probably one of the most normal things that happened at a time in which is still persistent, but which felt like really grounding. And I think that it reminded me that the story, these stories get to continue, and some things are not done yet. And I'm so glad for that. Thank you.
Thank you.